I now recognize the member for San Fernando East.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for allowing me to contribute in today's important debate. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I listened today intently to the Leader of the Opposition, and I marveled at how much of her presentation was not rooted in reality. It was a presentation, almost 3 hours of, I would say, fantasy, almost a fairy tale. It's one thing to craft a narrative around the facts. It's another thing entirely to create your own facts. And there was a lot of that happening today. It even got to the point where the opposition leader quoted a politically motivated economic commentator using her exact words, but did not cite source or give any credit to the originator of those words. Mr. Deputy Speaker, let me be clear. When it is all said and done, the current Minister of Finance will go down as the most accomplished in the history of Trinidad and Tobago. And I'm not just saying that because we work together. He has adroitly and expertly managed this economy over troubled waters and made the best of the very worst of times. Let me give you a quick synopsis of the kind of economy that greeted the current Minister of Finance when he first came into office in 2015. The past decade has maybe been the most difficult economic period in the history of this country. We had, of course, the global financial crisis in 2008, which dramatically affected energy prices, which we depend. There was the energy sector crash of 2014, which also saw oil and gas prices collapse. That didn't stop those from the other side, though, for implementing or foisting on this country 2 of the largest budgets in the history of Trinidad and Tobago, over $60 billion each. Compare that to this current budget of just $52 million with a revenue expectation of $52 billion with a revenue expectation of $43 billion. The Minister of Finance came into office in 2015 and was tasked with the job of stabilizing our economy. Of course, that meant bringing discipline to an economy and a people that had grown used to a life that was subsidized by gas and oil revenues. That format and strategy for our economy had become unsustainable. Of course, many of his decisions would have been unpopular, as discipline usually is. But being the Minister of Finance, contrary to what is being said or thought by those on the other side, is not a popularity contest. The Minister of Finance did what he had to do for our benefit. And of course, as we all know, discipline can be bitter in the moment, but in time will bear sweet fruit. One of the minister's greatest attributes is his ability to say no. I'm sure we all are familiar with that. 1, no to a lot of bad advice. Trust me, Mr. Deputy Speaker, at the Ministry of Finance, there is no shortage of bad advice coming from persons with neither fact nor figures, but wholeheartedly believing that their way is the only way. The Minister of Finance has to expertly and adroitly sift through all of these opinions coming his way and to make a decision that is in the best interest of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. That is no small feat, trust me. He has said no to special interest groups seeking their own interests at the expense of others. That too is also of no short supply when you are the Minister of Finance. He has said no to those and put the people of Trinidad and Tobago first. 3, he has said no to critics who have placed personal and political vendettas ahead of their professional reputations and integrity. There have been several commentators in the public domain who I call political activists masquerading as independent economic commentators who clearly have an axe to grind with the Minister or Ministry of Finance. And sadly, that they have been willing to sacrifice their professional integrity, credibility, and reputation in the furthering of that vendetta. The Minister of Finance has ignored them all, and rightfully so. Actually, one of those commentators was quoted today by the Honorable Opposition Leader, to my great surprise. This person, Mr. Deputy Speaker, has publicly stated and arrogated to themselves the ability to predict the future and said that Trinidad and Tobago, with absolute certainty, will run out of foreign exchange in 2022. And then later on, earlier this year, doubled down on that by saying that Trinidad and Tobago will experience a debt default in 2022. In our entire history as an independent country, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I want you to guess how many times Trinidad and Tobago has experienced a debt default. The answer is never. Not before, during, or after independence. Trinidad and Tobago has never defaulted on its debt. Never. You know that old quote from the movie, "We've never lost a man in space, and we're not going to start now"? Well, we have never had a debt default in Trinidad and Tobago, and I guarantee you that it will never be one under this government, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Another commentator with a personal axe to grind has been demanding that the Ministry of Finance or the government turn to the IMF for funding, all the while understanding exactly what that means and what comes with borrowing money from the IMF. The only problem is that the IMF has stated that countries like Trinidad and Tobago with an investment grade rating and the ability to access capital markets internationally for relatively cheap debt should not access the IMF for funding. Let me say that again, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The IMF has said that Trinidad and Tobago should not borrow from the IMF. But we have a local political activist masquerading as an economic independent person saying with certainty, absolute certainty, that we should access the IMF for funding. Mr. Speaker, this is an extremely bad idea and would not be good for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Borrowing money from the IMF comes with something called a structural adjustment. And let me explain to the national community exactly what a structural adjustment means. It would mean slashing thousands of jobs from our public service in the middle of an economic downturn where there aren't many jobs available right now in the private sector. That is what he has been asking the Minister of Finance to do, and is very, very upset that the Minister of Finance has been completely ignoring him. Incredible. Structural adjustment would mean the devaluation of our currency. Now, in an economy like ours, which is so dependent on imported goods, a sharp devaluation of our currency would cause a dramatic increase in the cost of living to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. That would be inhumane. The Minister of Finance and this government has always centered its policy around people, and it shall remain so. People first. It would also mean that the economic future of this country would not be decided anymore at Whitehall or in this Parliament chamber or at the economic complex in downtown Port-of-Spain. But decisions for the future of this country will now be made at the IMF headquarters in Washington, D.C. That is not a fate any of us should want for ourselves. But yet, this commentator will not let up in his opinion that we should access the IMF, even though he well knows the consequences of doing so. Mr. Deputy Speaker, fortunately for the people of Trinidad and Tobago, wishing does not make it so. Let me state the facts for everyone to understand clearly. Trinidad and Tobago has never defaulted on its debts, never. And we are nowhere close to doing so now. We are currently the only investment-grade country in the region, the only one. Our investment-grade rating was given by a well-respected international rating agency. This is really a definition of our ability to borrow funds. It's a credit score, essentially. And Trinidad and Tobago is the only country with an investment grade rating. We are even rated higher than many countries in Latin America, including Brazil. Yet, the opposition leader will come here today to say that Trinidad and Tobago has the worst economy in the region. As I said, much of what I heard today was nothing more than pure fantasy, not rooted in reality. Our careful and strategic financial management during the worst of times has caused the Standard & Poor's rating agency to affirm our investment-grade credit rating. Our current reserves, foreign reserves, stand at $7.5 billion US, with our HSF assets under management standing at almost $6 billion, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Earlier, the opposition leader said that this government had been engaging in profligate spending and accessing funds in the HSF. Nothing could be further from the truth. Let me reiterate that the assets under management currently at the HSF is higher than what this government met in the HSF in 2015. What the opposition leader does not understand is that the assets in the HSF have been invested in stocks and bonds internationally, and we have been simply spending the return on our investments. We have not spent any principal. But the opposition leader either didn't know or didn't understand how that works. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is not an election budget, but it is a growth and development budget. There are three policy documents which undermine everything that this government does in terms of national development. I'm going to list these documents here so that the national community can easily access these documents online. So when you see headlines in the media saying that there is no plan, you can clearly tell those that there is a plan if they would only read it. Those three documents are the Vision 2030 plan. That is available online. And also the Roadmap to Recovery Committee Report 1 and 2. Those two documents are also online. Reading those documents, you will see exactly how this budget, this growth and development budget, fits in to our long-term strategic developmental goals. I would invite the national community to read these documents. This government has laid the economic road out of this global crisis and paved the path to developed country status while protecting the most vulnerable amongst us. There are three pillars to this year's budget. One is diversification. 2, agriculture. 3, maintaining our social safety net, which means protecting the most vulnerable. That is people-centered policy, and that is what this party and government is all about. For the agricultural sector, and I would dare say that this government has done more for the agricultural sector than any government in the history of Trinidad and Tobago, including the one managed by those on the other side. The Ministry of Finance has established a stimulus fund, an agriculture stimulus fund of $300 million, devoted strictly to the domestic agricultural industry. It's twofold. One is to improve our food security, and 2, it is to give our people options to access food locally so that we can preserve our foreign exchange instead of importing food for consumption. This government has focused all of its policies on enhancing the lives of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. During this dreaded global COVID crisis, this government has spent in excess of $5 billion in supporting the people in Trinidad and Tobago during this time of need. And we will continue to spend to the benefit of the people of Trinidad and Tobago until we are certain that this economy is back on its feet again. During this time, over 5,000 people have received salary relief grants. We've also given loans to SMEs. This budget here has added technical support to SMEs because we realized that many of the SMEs were having difficulty accessing loans because their financial houses were not in order. So we have supplied technical support to help our SME sector to be strengthened and then eventually listed on the stock market so they can access private capital. That is what a true growth strategic plan, economic plan sounds like. Our food hamper program, though derailed by those on the other side, has benefited tens of thousands of grateful people in Trinidad and Tobago. Our COVID relief programs will continue into the near future until we are certain that this economy is back on its feet. I'm certain that many do not realize the aggressive legislative agenda of the Ministry of Finance. And before I entered the ministry, I did not realize exactly just how much law and legislation was involved. But if you've been paying attention, you would know that we have been working to strengthen and to really democratize our tax safety net. And let me explain what that means. The TTRA is designed to promote equity and efficiency when it comes to tax collection in Trinidad and Tobago. I have an uncle, his name is Uncle Lincoln, and one of his favorite sayings has always been, "Many hands make for light work." Mr. Deputy Speaker, if we can bring more people under the tax net to pay their fair share, it means that over time there will be a lighter tax load for all. That is what the TTRA is about. It's about equity and efficiency. The TTRA bill was first laid in Parliament more than 11 years ago. When those on the other side were in office, they ignored it and allowed it to languish, even though they knew that those tax revenues were important to the survival of the economy of Trinidad and Tobago. The TTRA has been designed, as I said, to bring more efficiency and equity. It is due to the increased tax revenues expected by the government in the new fiscal year that we were able to remove importation duties and VAT on many basic food items to benefit some of the more vulnerable people in Trinidad and Tobago. When I say many hands make for light work, that is what I'm talking about. Because we have a higher expectation of tax collection in the upcoming fiscal year, we can allow some tax relief in other areas to improve the lives of our citizenship. You'd have to ask those on the other side why they have been resisting and opposing this bill and measure for so long. Those concerned about the independence of the institution only have to look to the appointment of the head of the division of the TTRA, the Deputy Director General. This person will be appointed by the Public Service Commission, the PSC, and will hold office till retirement. That means that this person will be immune from political manipulation. That is what independence is about. When it comes to the executive arm of the TTRA, the Director General, the executive head of this body, will be a person approved by the Parliament. That's this August chamber here. He or she will enforce revenue laws only by way of civil proceedings. That means the court system also acts as a check and a balance to the TTRA. That is independence. So all of the concerns about the independence of this institution have been completely unfounded. The TTRA will democratize tax collection in Trinidad and Tobago. It will bring equity and efficiency, and it will mean a lighter tax burden over time for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I move on to the gaming bill, or Gambling, Gaming and Betting Control Act, which was brought to this Parliament earlier in 2021. This is yet another one of those bills that those on the other side refuse to support to protect those who may benefit from this formerly unregulated and potentially damaging and dangerous industry. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in the first year of implementation, this important piece of legislation is expected to collect 500 million TT dollars in tax revenues per year. That is $500 million in tax revenues, which this government and country did not have access to previously. Again, Mr. Deputy Speaker, many hands lighten the load. This $16 billion formerly unregulated industry was completely ignored by those on the other side. $16 billion industry. You would have to ask them why. I move on to the property tax. Mr. Deputy Speaker, there's been a lot of anxiety in the public domain about property taxes and a lot of misinformation, a lot of it fueled by those on the other side. I'm here to allay the fears of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. The average homeowner of Trinidad and Tobago has nothing to fear from the property tax. It simply replaces the old land and building tax. I heard one trade union leader this week saying that the government should not implement property taxes, but instead implement a wealth tax. Sadly, this ill-informed gentleman doesn't seem to realize that the property tax is a wealth tax. The larger and more luxurious your home, clearly the more you will pay in taxes. If you owned many homes, 5, 6, 7, 8 homes, like maybe many of those on the other side, clearly you would have to pay more in taxes than someone who owns a single family home. If you own a pink palace, clearly you'd have to pay more than the average Trinbagonian. Property taxes are designed to support local government reform, and that's something that I've been hearing over and over today from the other side. They've been quite disingenuous, saying that they would agree with property taxes if only the taxes were used within the local government system where those revenues were generated. They know full well that for us to have local government reform, we must implement property taxes. And I'll give you San Fernando East as an example. San Fernando East is an extremely residential constituency. If we decided to raise revenues in San Fernando East to supply services to the people of San Fernando East for local government matters, the majority of those revenues would have to come from property taxes. You're hearing those on the other side saying that, well, they're not supporting property taxes because it won't be used in local government reform, when we need property taxes to have local government reform in the first place. It's a chicken and egg scenario. But they know that full well. And I guarantee you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, just like they did not support this property tax bill, when we bring the local government reform bill to this parliament, they won't support that either. Because that is what they do. They oppose for opposing's sake. I have a list here from the Property Tax Act. And I'm really working to allay some of the fears that I've seen in the public domain where property taxes are concerned. I want the national community to know that they have nothing to fear. The average Trinbagonian has nothing to fear. There are 4 property classes: residential, commercial, industrial, agricultural. For residential, the annual tax value is 90% of the annual rental income expected to be earned from such property as determined by the Commissioner of Valuations under the provisions of the Valuation Land Act. The tax rate on that 90%, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is 3%. That is for residential homeowners, just 3%. Commercial, annual tax value, 90% of the annual rental income expected to be earned from such property. For commercial property, 5%, Mr. Deputy Speaker, 5% of 90% of the annual rental income expected to be earned from such property. Just 5%. For industrial property, plant and machinery housed in building, calculated as the value of the plant and machinery that is housed in a building, less any applicable allowances and deductions. Just 6% of that, Mr. Deputy Speaker. For plant and machinery not housed in a building, calculated as the value of the plant and machinery that is not housed in a building, less any applicable allowances and deductions. Just 3%. Does that sound draconian, Mr. Deputy Speaker? I'm sure if more members of our population understood, one, the benefits of paying taxes, and also the modest rates that are being charged, there would be less anxiety about the property tax. A lot of it being fermented by misinformation by those on the other side, but this government will deal with that in due course. Agricultural property. Annual tax value, 2% of the open market value, capital value of the land property. 1% rate of tax, Mr. Deputy Speaker, on agricultural lands. That's it. Nothing draconian, nothing sinister. A modest tax rate to ensure that this government can supply the services that make your property habitable in the first place. You could not enjoy the use of your property if we did not supply roads, drains, fire, police, or other local government services, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I move on to the Trinidad and Tobago Mortgage Bank. Earlier this year, it was announced, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that there will be a merger between the Home Mortgage Bank, the HMB, and the Trinidad and Tobago Finance Company, the TTFC. This will be merged to form a single entity called the Trinidad and Tobago Mortgage Bank. This entity was designed to, one, finance the construction of further homes in Trinidad and Tobago, and I know we had announced during this budget presentation that the HDC will be reformed to ensure that one arm deals strictly with landlord services and another with construction. The TTMB is designed to finance these operations. It also makes lower interest rate loans more accessible to prospective homeowners in Trinidad and Tobago. That is what it's all about. It is about this government listening to the people of Trinidad and Tobago and supplying them with what it is they need at an affordable rate. That is what the Ministry of Finance has been doing. That is what the Minister of Finance has focused much of our policy agenda around. The TTMB will eventually be involved in an initial public offering. This is designed to really satisfy the investment community of Trinidad and Tobago that are always seeking TT dollar assets that allow them to make investments which they can use to meet their future financial obligations. Mr. Deputy Speaker, let me reiterate that this budget was one for the people. It is one that is focused on growth and development. And as I said earlier, my Uncle Lincoln always says, many hands make for light work. The more people that are brought under the tax net and allowed or implored to pay their fair share, the lighter the burden it will be on all of us. Do not allow those on the other side to mislead you and have a few people carrying the burden for everyone. I thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.